Isaiah. I love this book. There's so much rich stuff in Isaiah. Isaiah has been called the miniature Bible, and for good reason. There are 66 chapters in Isaiah. There are 66 books in the Bible. Isaiah splits up nicely into two sections. The first section is chapters 1 through 39. And those chapters are really all about Judah and Israel's sins and God's judgments and the punishment that awaits if they don't turn from their sin. But then the second portion of Isaiah is chapters 40 through 66. And that second chapter is so different from the first section of the book that a lot of people said there's no way the same Isaiah wrote that. It's completely different. Now, it turns out the same Isaiah did write both sections of the book, but the second section of the book has much more glorious and hopeful language. There's a lot of messianic elements to that second portion of Isaiah. There's messianic elements in the first portion as well, but they really just come to their climax in the second half, the second portion of the book. And really, the Bible itself is all about Jesus, right? And in many ways, Isaiah is too. Isaiah gives us some of the strongest glimpses of the Christ, more so than many of the other books of the Old Testament. So for those reasons and others, Isaiah has been called the miniature Bible. And as we think about the miniature Bible, think about that word miniature, because that's the word that I want us to call to mind as we read Isaiah chapter 40 tonight. This is a chapter that makes me feel extremely small, because this chapter is all about the greatness of God and how large God is. And I don't mean in a physical or spatial sense, just the idea that God is over and above and greater than everything that we experience, everything that we see, even don't see. God is greater than all of those things. Look at verse 10, Isaiah chapter 40, and let's just make our way tonight from Isaiah 40 and verse 10 all the way through the end of the chapter, okay? Isaiah 40 and verse 10, "Behold, the Lord God will come with might, with His arm ruling for Him. Behold, His reward is with Him, and His recompense before Him." I'm not going to make trips around the pulpit. I had to go get the clicker. This is not a calisthenics exercise for me. Notice verse 10 talks about God's arm. The arm of God. When you see that expression, I want you to think about God's might and His power and His strength. His arm is ruling for Him. You know, sometimes when we go out to do manual labor, we talk about rolling our sleeves up and we bare our arms so we can get ready for work. And when you see God bearing His arm in the Scriptures, watch out. Okay? It's an expression of His power and His strength. His enemies won't stand a chance. He's going to come through and just wipe them out. But the same arm that is so powerful to do that, look at the next verse. "Like a shepherd, He will tend His flock, and in His arm He will gather the lambs and carry them in His bosom, and He will gently lead the nursing youth." The same arm that is so strong and mighty and powerful and can just wipe out enemies is the same arm that shows tenderness to His people. And you picture God like that shepherd picking up His people, holding them close to His breast and nurturing them and caring for them. And you see that tenderness that comes through. And it's just an amazing contrast to see the way that God can deal with His enemies, but the way that He can also deal with His people. Now look at verse 12. Isaiah starts to tell us about who God is, and he wants to show us how great God is. And he tells us in verses 12 through 14 that God is greater than the creation. Look at verse 12. "Who has measured the waters in the hollow of His hand?" If you've ever looked at a globe, you know that there's a lot of water on the earth. The oceans and the lakes and the rivers. I believe when I was in elementary school, they taught us that 3/4 of the surface of the earth was covered with water. And that just talks about the surface of the earth. That doesn't even talk about how deep the oceans are. There are some places on the earth where the oceans are 7 miles deep, taller than any mountain on earth. And God says, yeah, it all just fits right there in the palm of my hand. Isn't that incredible? "Who has marked off the heavens by the span? In the Bible, the span is a unit of measurement. And it's the measurement between the tip of your thumb to the tip of your pinky finger. That's the span. It's typically about 9 inches. If you're really tall, it might be 10 inches. So if you were to say to God, God, how expansive, how large is the universe? He'd say, oh, it's about that big. Isn't that incredible? He measures it with the span. It says that He has calculated the dust of the earth by the measure. All of the dust of the earth, all of the deserts, all of the wilderness areas, God knows how many specks of dust there are on this earth. He's able to measure that. It says that He has weighed the mountains in a balance or in scales. And He has weighed the hills in a pair of scales. Measures, balance, scales. Those are all things that we use to make judgments. You know, you get a pair of scales and you weigh the scales and make sure that things are balanced. And Isaiah says that God deals with the created world the way that we deal with minute objects. You know, we put things on the scales to make sure that they're balanced and to make sure that the coin matches up with the grain or whatever it is that we're doing as we find these equivalents. Isaiah says, yeah, that's the way God measures the world. He deals with all of these things that are so much greater than us. He deals with those in the way that we deal with minute objects. And then I love this, verse 13. He turns the attention to us and He says, who has directed the Spirit of the Lord, or as His counselor has informed Him? With whom did He consult, and who gave Him understanding? And who taught Him in the path of justice, and taught Him knowledge, and informed Him of the way of understanding? In other words, did God ask you for your input when He was doing any of this? When God was creating everything that we see and everything that even we don't see, did God reach out to you for help? Did He ask you to explain all of this to Him? Go to Job chapter 26. There's some language here that I love. Job 26. Job is speaking in this chapter. And if you start reading at verse 11, Job 26 and verse 11, he says, the pillars of heaven tremble and are astonished at His rebuke. He stirs up the sea with His power, and by His understanding He breaks up the storm. By His Spirit He adorned the heavens. His hand pierced the fleeing serpent. Indeed, these are the mere edges of His ways. This is just a fraction of what God is able to do. And I love this next expression. And how small a whisper we hear of Him, but the thunder of His power, who can understand? Job says, look around. The mountains, the hills, the rocks, the trees, the sky, the clouds, everything that's out there, it's just a whisper of what God is able to do. That's just barely touching the hem of the garment of what His power is capable of. Now, you know the story of Job, and we're not going to analyze that tonight, but you know, Job and his friends, they keep having exchanges with one another, and his friends are not really all that good of friends, are they? Did Job, all this bad stuff happen to you because you're a rotten scoundrel? That's why God's punishing you. And Job says, no, I'm innocent, I'm righteous, I'm blameless, and they fight about that essentially for 35 chapters. Well, then in chapter 38, God speaks to Job and He says, listen up. And God's going to straighten out Job's thinking. Basically, we could summarize the last few chapters of Job with the same language that Isaiah used. Did God seek your counsel when He was creating the world? Did God ask for your input and your advice? Does God need your help to do the things that He is able to do? As one preacher used to say, you know, we need to be careful about whittling on God's end of the stick. Job, you let me be God, and you be you. But if you look in Job chapter 42, after God says a lot of things to him. I love what Job says when he's just left there speechless. He knows he has no response to make to God. Job answered verse 1 of chapter 42, I know that you can do everything, and that no purpose of yours can be withheld from you. You asked, who is this who hides counsel without knowledge? Therefore I have uttered what I did not understand, things too wonderful for me, which I did not know. That's exactly right, Job. You were speaking above your level of knowledge. And it's amazing to me how men today do the same thing. In all of our technological and scientific advancements, we're getting so smart, and we've got these letters after our name which make us really smart because we paid a lot of money for those letters. And we have come to the point where we know more about ourselves than God does. We know more about this universe than God does. And what I want us to recognize from that is that that's an ancient problem. And there are times when we, like Job, need to come to the realization that the things that God has shown to us in this universe, just a whisper. It's not even a fraction of what God is able to do. And we need to be careful before we start taking on this attitude that thinks we know more than God. Now go back to Isaiah chapter 40. Isaiah chapter 40. As we keep pondering these things that Isaiah is giving us, things that Job considered to be too wonderful for him. Isaiah chapter 40, now Isaiah says, God is not only greater than the creation, but as we bring it to earth now, verses 15 to 17, he says, God is greater than any nation on this earth. Behold, the nations are like a drop from a bucket, and are regarded as a speck of dust on the scales. Behold, he lifts up the islands like fine dust. The nations are a drop in the bucket. If you're carrying a bucket around and it's only got one drop of water in it, how heavy is that? Well, obviously we'd say the bucket's empty. And that's exactly what it is for God to deal with these nations. It takes no effort at all, just like it would take to carry around one single drop of water. The nations are counted like small dust on a balance. And I love this picture. Here's this man who pulls out this dusty old book that's been sitting in his grandma's attic for 100 years. And he opens up that book and he goes, and you see that dust. Sorry for all you people in the first 4 rows. You see all that dust, it just scatters. What does God have to do to make a nation of this earth go away? That's it. That's all he's got to do. Verse 16 is interesting. Even Lebanon is not enough to burn, nor its beasts enough for a burnt offering. In the Bible we read about the cedars of Lebanon. If the entire region of Lebanon, with all of its beautiful and majestic cedar trees, were to be lit on fire, that would not be a large enough burnt offering to give to God. If you took all of the animals that are in that region and they were consumed in that flame, it wouldn't be enough to worship the name of God. All of the nations are as nothing before Him. They are regarded by Him as less than nothing and meaningless. Now, don't misunderstand what Isaiah is saying there. He's not saying God doesn't care about people on the earth. There's a number of things in this chapter that would argue against that. He's simply saying these nations cannot stand before God. And if one of these nations gets too big for its britches, and they start to think that they're greater than God and that they have brought about their own power, He'll take care of that. Because He can reduce them, because they're nothing but dust. I'm going to hold off on that verse. Let's keep reading. Look at verse 18. Verses 18 to 20. Now Isaiah says, God is greater than all of your idols. And that's important because we need to think about the context of this book. The nation of Israel is rampant with idolatry. And because of that, God is going to use other nations, like the ones we've just discussed, to punish them. And so he says, you need to start thinking about your own personal religious life. To whom then will you liken God? Or what likeness will you compare with Him? What about your idol? A craftsman casts it. A goldsmith plates it with gold, and a silversmith fashions chains of silver. He who is too impoverished for such an offering selects a tree that does not rot. He seeks out for himself a skillful craftsman to prepare an idol that will not totter. He says, we've got people here in this nation who are given over to idolatry, and if they're wealthy enough to go to a goldsmith and a silversmith to make their idol for them, they'll do that. But if they're not wealthy enough for gold and silver, they'll just go out and find them a tree and start whittling on that tree like we talked about a moment ago. But you got to be real careful when you make this idol, because if you don't make it just right, it'll topple over. Now here's what Isaiah is saying. And I want to be careful about using this word, but Isaiah uses this word. Isaiah says, it is stupid to give your faith to these idols. Now all the parents of young children are like, oh, you had to say that. We've been fighting our kids about using that word, and I'm sorry, but it's in the Bible. Look for it. How foolish it is to go to a craftsman and say, can you please make this thing so that it'll stand up and won't fall over? You know, it's not good when your idol falls over, right? So they're going to great lengths to make an idol that won't topple over, and God says, what you making your idol out of there? A tree. Ah, where'd the tree come from? Well, it came from the ground. Yeah, I know. That's how I designed it, remember? Well, what you making your idol out of there? Beautiful silver. Yeah. Where'd the silver come from? You see how foolish it is? Isaiah says, people, it's time for us to wake up. Now, verse 21. Do you not know? Have you not heard? Has it not been declared to you from the beginning? Have you not understood from the foundations of the earth? It is He who sits above the circle of the earth, and its inhabitants are like grasshoppers, who stretches out the heavens like a curtain and spreads them out like a tent to dwell in. Now Isaiah starts to shift his attention to the rulers of the earth. Verse 23, He it is who reduces rulers and kings to nothing, who makes the judges of the earth meaningless. Scarcely have they been planted, scarcely have they been sown, scarcely has their stock taken root in the earth, but He merely blows on them and they wither, and the storm carries them away like stubble. We're just a bunch of grasshoppers in comparison to God. What do you do when you see grasshoppers? I know what I do. God looks at us. I don't go out of my way to find grasshoppers, okay? Bugs generally. Maybe it would have been better to just say that. God looks down at us and we're just a bunch of little bugs. That's how much bigger He is than we are. That's how much greater He is than we are. And by the way, those rulers of the earth, they're gone. And so all of this is working to a climax. And Isaiah comes to that climax in verse 25. To whom then will you liken me, that I would be His equal, says the Holy One. What are you going to compare me to? You think about all these expressions that we've just read, and God says, go ahead, take a stab at it. Who are you going to compare me to? And yet you've turned away from me and you've turned to these foolish idols. Lift up your eyes on high and see who has created these stars. The one who leads forth their host by number. He calls them all by name. Because of the greatness of His might and the strength of His power, not one of them is missing. I love this picture. You can all read the yellow text at the bottom of the picture, can't you? You see what that says? Yeah, that little tiny pixel on the screen, that's our sun. And you know, the earth is a lot smaller than the sun. And I'm a lot smaller than the earth. See, that's our galaxy. And from what I understand, scientists and researchers who have these pretty cool tools they call telescopes that allow them to shoot way out into space and see things that you can't see with your naked eye. Here we are in our Milky Way galaxy, and they tell me that there are billions more out there. Miniature. You see how small we are? To whom then will you liken me? God says there are billions and billions and billions of stars out there. And by the way, I have names for every single one of them. It's amazing. I tried to find some pictures of planets and stars in a comparison chart to put here on the screen. I came across some pretty neat pictures online, but it didn't quite transfer. It just didn't look right. And I figured if all I was going to do was confuse you, it wasn't worth putting them up there. But do some research about that. It's pretty incredible. So, now the last 5 verses of the chapter. Isaiah says, verse 27, "Why do you say, O Jacob, and assert, O Israel? My way is hidden from the Lord, and the justice due me escapes the notice of God." Really? You think there's anything you can do that God doesn't know about when He has a name for every single star in the universe that He created? The universe which He can say, oh yeah, it's that big. You think He escapes? You think you escape the notice of God? Do you not know? Verse 28, have you not heard? The everlasting God, the Lord, the Creator of the ends of the earth, does not become weary or tired. His understanding is inscrutable. He gives strength to the weary, and to him who lacks might, He increases power. Though youths grow weary and tired, and vigorous young men stumble badly, yet those who wait for the Lord will gain new strength. They will mount up with wings like eagles. They will run and not get tired. They will walk and not become weary. Those are familiar verses to you, I know. They better be. We sang them this morning. But this is this conclusion that Isaiah has been working to in this chapter. So let's make 3 quick applications from this chapter. Number 1, God is awesome. I've said this to you before, and maybe I shouldn't say it again. Or at least I think I've said this to you before. Sometimes we preach in various places and we say things and we forget where we said them. But I really try not to use the word awesome very much. Hey man, this chocolate ice cream is awesome. And we do that. And I'm not gonna, if you do that, I'm not gonna hit you or anything. I understand what we mean when we talk like that. But when we use that language, and we use it a lot, what are we gonna say when we truly do see something that is awesome? What words are there? Words would fail us. I read this chapter and I think, God is awesome. Number 2. In all of His greatness, He still cares about me. I, who am just a silly little grasshopper, but not to God. He's not going to step on me. He cares about me. He listens to me. He wants me to talk to Him. 1 Peter 5 and verse 7 says, cast all of your cares upon Him because He cares for you. This is the God that I get to pray to. And this is the God that I get to lift up my concerns to. You think He can handle them? Boy, I don't know. You think God is able to take care of my problems? I don't know. I mean, I think He can. I think my problems are just another speck of dust for Him. Go to Psalm 8. Psalm 8, again, probably a familiar text to us. Psalm 8, verse 3. When I consider your heavens and the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars which you have ordained, what is man that you are mindful of him, and the Son of Man that you visit him? For you have made him a little lower than the angels, and you have crowned him with glory and honor. Who am I, God? When I look into this universe, and remember, think about David, shepherd David, who lays out in the fields at night with those sheep, and he looks up into the night sky, and he sees all of those billions of stars, and he says, God, you made all of this. Why do you care about me? Who am I that you should listen to me and want to be concerned for me? What is man that you are mindful of him? But you have crowned us with glory and honor. You've crowned man, humanity, with glory and honor. In all of His greatness, with all of the things that God has done in the creation, with all of the things that He has to do in keeping this world going round and around and keeping everything from just falling apart, when I get down on my knees and when I say, Dear God, He says, yes. That's powerful. Number 3. Trust Him. Romans chapter 8. This passage is powerful to me all the time, but especially in light of what we've talked about tonight. Romans 8, verse 28. And we know that all things work together for good to those who love God, to those who are called according to His purpose. Notice it doesn't say that all things are good. This is not a promise that you will never face bad times in your life, that bad people will never come into your life. It doesn't say all things are good, but it says all things work together for good. How does that happen? I have no idea. How is it that God is able to take a hurricane that devastates an entire geographic area and bring about good from that? I don't know. How is it that God can take things like rape and murder and pillaging and plunder and turn that into good things for those who love Him, those who suffer? I don't know. How is it that God is able to take all of the bad things that can happen to His people and somehow just make everything okay? I don't know. I don't have to know. And frankly, if God tried to sit down and explain it to me, I wouldn't be able to handle it. Somehow, in God's infinite power and wisdom, while He's got all of this stuff going on, God's plate is pretty full, wouldn't you say? He's keeping the entire universe hanging together. You know, we had that solar eclipse recently. And isn't it amazing that the weather people and the meteorologists and all that, they're able to say, okay, the next solar eclipse is going to happen on such and such a date at this place on the earth. It's going to follow this path, and it's going to have totality for 47 seconds or whatever. That's amazing. You know what that is? God. It's mathematics, it's science, it's God saying, yeah, I did that. And all I did was open my mouth. So God is keeping the entire universe from falling apart. And He's got millions of people on this earth who are lifting up prayers to Him. And He's just juggling all of that, no problem. Right? Trust Him. Because God makes it all work out okay. Those who wait for the Lord. Those who wait for the Lord. Those are the ones for whom everything works out okay. Now, that doesn't just mean wait in the sense of sit there and do nothing and just let God take care of everything. We've got all kinds of problems in our lives. We've got all kinds of things that are bothering us and working against us. And we say, you know what? The Bible tells me to wait on the Lord, so I'm just going to sit right here and do nothing and say, take care of it, God. That's not what it means. It's not what it means. Wait on the Lord means put your faith and your trust in God, and you keep going, and you keep fighting, and you keep going, putting one foot in front of the other, and you know all the while that eventually God in His grace and wisdom and power, He's just going to make it all work out okay. That's what it means to wait. And when you wait on the Lord, He gives you new strength. You will begin running and never get tired, because God never gets tired. You will walk and you will not become weary, because God never becomes weary. His strength works through us. His strength works for us. And when we wait on Him, all of these things work together for us. Trust Him. Well, that's the end of my note card. So I guess that means the sermon's over. Thank you for listening. Read this chapter and feel small, but know that you are not insignificant. God has taken heaven and He has turned it upside down to bless His people.